It gives me great pleasure to introduce our special guest today. It's James Nichols, insolvency solicitor and barrister, who is going to talk to us about myths and legends in bankruptcy. Welcome, James.
Hi, Nick.
James, I'm just going to go through some key concerns that we get quite frequently, and I'd just like, if you wouldn't mind, to go through what your take is on these.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so in terms of bankruptcy, they take all your possessions. Is it fact or myth?
Okay, Nick, that's a complete myth.
Mm-hmm.
These days, when you become bankrupt, you're interviewed by the official receiver, and he talks about your assets, but that doesn't mean that you have to give up your flat screen television or your stereo or your nice kitchen or anything like that. They're interested in assets that are sellable and very valuable, and that are not part of your normal domestic needs. Gone are the days when bailiffs on behalf of trustees in bankruptcy visited your house to take all of this sort of thing away. If you had something of exceptional value, such as a Queen Anne chair, then yes, they might be interested in that. But for the vast majority of people with ordinary things around their houses, they get to keep all of that. Bankruptcy isn't about reducing you to utmost poverty.
Thank you for that. Another thing we get is you can't get a bank account, can you?
Again, this is a complete myth. Bankrupts, I mean, everyone needs a bank account now. Just because somebody goes bankrupt doesn't mean they can't get a bank account. Mm-hmm. Sometimes some banks can be a bit funny, but most of the banks now have procedures for opening a bank account shortly after someone's become bankrupt, and they generally won't give you much credit. Mm-hmm. You might not be able to get very much of an overdraft, but it is totally accepted that you'll need a bank account and that you can have one. And the thing is, Nick, there's no law saying you can't have one. So you go along to your local branch and you say, I need to open a bank account. So it's not a problem.
Okay, thanks, James. Does it go in the newspaper? If I'm made bankrupt, does it in fact go in the newspaper?
Okay, it used to be that for most bankrupts, they did put a tiny needle notice in a local newspaper. Mm-hmm. Basically, that was in the days when most of the people who were going bankrupt were small traders, and the idea was to tell everyone in the local area that someone had gone bankrupt in order to find out who was owed any money. Yeah. Because the vast majority of bankrupts these days are people who've just taken too much personal credit, there's actually no point in doing that. So largely the adverts are no longer made. It isn't the case in every case, but for most ordinary people, again, there is no advert in the local newspaper.
Okay, thank you for that, James. The one that comes up quite a bit is, I'll lose my car, won't I?
Okay, Nick, this can be a little bit of a complicated area, a bit like the issue that we talked about earlier in the home. Cars can be very valuable, and if you own one outright, and it's a very valuable car, then it might be the case that it has to be sold. But for most ordinary domestic cars which are on some kind of finance agreement, usually the case is that people don't lose their cars. So again, one of the myths is that your life comes to an end and that you can't have anything. But for most people with ordinary cars on hire purchase or lease finance, they will be able to keep those cars. People who've got top of the range Mercedes or top of the range Audis, then the issue is that they might be spending a great deal of money keeping that agreement going. And that's the issue that may affect it. But if you've got a fairly standard family saloon, no, you get to keep that sort of car.
Sure. Thanks for that, James. Will my employer know?
There's actually no reason why your employer should know. Yeah. And there's no automatic writing to your employer by anybody saying that this individual has gone bankrupt. But it's one of those things where the fact is that it's probably a little bit like being gay. You don't realise how many people around you are already bankrupt, because the fact is you don't know it because they haven't told you. Sure. And there are people around all of us who are gay and who are bankrupt. And it's one of those things where in a sense, there'd be no reason not to mention it to your employer. And the employer has probably seen bankrupt people before, probably knows a little bit more about it, having seen it before, and therefore it won't affect your employment. So, in some senses, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to tell them. But if you, strictly speaking, didn't want to tell them, they don't need to know, and you don't have to tell them.
So there's no legal reason why they should?
There's no legal reason why you should tell them, and there's no legal reason why anybody should write to them.
Okay, I appreciate that. As we get around people that are in rented accommodation,
Yeah.
and they ask, will my landlord know if I go bankrupt?
Very similar to your employer. There's actually no reason why the landlord should know. The landlord is unlikely to be a creditor because you pay up front for your rent.
Sure.
And you're unlikely to be, the landlord would not be written to unless there was an asset there. And although a landlord may have a deposit, that is usually a deposit held on trust in respect of future rent and future dilapidation. So again, the trustee in bankruptcy or official receiver would very rarely write to a landlord and tell the landlord. But again, there's no reason why the landlord should care, even if he got a letter or even got notice of you becoming bankrupt. Because providing you carry on paying your rent, there's no reason why you should have to move out.
Another one that we get is, can I sell my home in the future? So if I've got a house,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at selling it sometime in the future, the fact that I've been bankrupt or not, will that affect my ability to sell the house?
The good thing is that the law changed in 1986, and it changed again in the year 2003 as well. And the thing is that in the bad old days, if you like, your house could be affected for a long time. There were a great deal of cases from the 1980s, before 1986, and prior to that, where a house was claimed in a bankruptcy and then sold many years later. And there was an awful lot of quite immoral dealings going on, and because of that, this rumour has persisted. But if you go bankrupt today, it's a very simple matter of how your house is dealt with. But if you remain in it and continue paying your mortgage, it will be your house again in the future, and you will be able to deal with it, sell it, make renovations to it or whatever. Remember, Nick, bankruptcy only lasts a year now in most circumstances. Mm-hmm. So it's only during that year that you are an official bankrupt. After that, you're as free as anybody to do what you want. We talked a little bit earlier about what happens with your home, and I'd recommend anybody who's listening to this to go and look at that piece, because it can be complicated. But again, most people don't lose their homes because of bankruptcy.
Another common one that comes up is an IVA the only solution that will save my house?
There is a whole industry involved in IVAs, as you know, that's individual voluntary arrangements, and they can be very convincing as a way to hold on to your home, but it's certainly not the case that is the only way to hang on to your home. IVAs can be a good solution for certain sorts of people, but for many people they are inappropriate, they are expensive, and they are very unfortunately, they often lead into bankruptcy a few years later. So IVAs can be very useful, but they need to be considered with a great deal of care. And I think we've all got concerns that sometimes people go into an IVA when really they'd be much better off going bankrupt.
Thank you, James. Another question that comes up a lot is, will I be able to access credit in the future?
Essentially, whilst you're bankrupt, you are not allowed to take more than £500 credit without telling the person that you are bankrupt. Mm-hmm. Now, mostly these days when you go and seek to borrow any money, they'll do a credit search on you. Mm-hmm. And certainly your credit rating with the credit rating agencies is going to be badly affected. So generally you will be a very poor credit risk for a certain time. However, whilst bankruptcy lasts a year, after that year you're allowed to borrow as much money as you want to again, just like you did in the past. Mm-hmm. I find that most people who've been bankrupt don't want to take too much credit again in the future, but they don't want to be banned. We live in a world of credit. It's credit everywhere. So there's no reason why people should be prevented forever. Now, the first thing is there's nothing in the law saying you can't borrow again. The second thing, though, is that your credit rating is going to be affected, and you will have to gradually build your credit rating up again. So it's the kind of things that we recommend for anybody who's got a poor credit rating, is take out a very small loan, for example, at first, and pay it back relatively quickly. Now, that will massively improve your credit rating. Also, make sure that you do manage your finances going forward better than you have in the past. So if you enter into direct debit arrangements with, hiring your television or hiring, your car, make sure you do make those payments, because all those things go towards improving your credit rating. It's your credit rating which stops you getting credit in the future, not any law. And there are lots of things that we can do to help people improve their credit ratings.
Well, thank you, James. That was James Nichols, insolvency solicitor and barrister, our special guest. Many thanks indeed.